My name is Harper Sinclair, and I am 31 years old, and on a Saturday afternoon in June, I stood in the upstairs office of the Ashford Estate, a wedding venue in the Virginia countryside, watching a security camera feed of my younger sister, Emma, walking down the aisle in a $12,000 dress that I had paid for at a wedding. I had not been invited to in a venue that I had owned for the past 8 months, and the only reason I was calm, the only reason I wasn't shaking with rage or hurt, was because I had planned this exact moment 3 weeks ago when my sister sent me a text that said, "The guest list is full, hope you understand." And I had replied with a thumbs-up emoji because I knew she would find out the truth in about 90 minutes when the venue coordinator handed her the final bill. Let me take you back because this story doesn't start with a wedding. It starts with a lifetime of being my sister's ATM and my parents' backup plan, and the invisible person who made everyone else's dreams possible, while her own didn't even make it onto the family calendar. I grew up in a suburb outside of Richmond, with my parents, Michael and Diane, and my younger sister Emma, who was 4 years younger than me, and born with the kind of face and personality that made adults stop and say, "Oh, she's going to be something special," and I was the one standing next to her holding her coat while they said it. Emma was beautiful in the way that opens doors. She had blonde hair and green eyes and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and people gave her things. They gave her attention and compliments and opportunities, and she learned very early that the world would say yes to her if she just asked sweetly enough, and I learned very early that I was the person who made sure she didn't have to ask twice. I wasn't ugly, I wasn't unlikable, I was just normal. And in a family where one daughter was exceptional, normal felt like a diagnosis, and my parents didn't treat me badly, they just treated me like I was already handled, like I didn't need the same level of attention or investment because I wasn't going to give them the same return. And by the time I was 16, I had stopped expecting anything different. I put myself through college with scholarships and loans and part-time jobs, and I graduated with a degree in business administration and got a job at a corporate consulting firm, and I worked my way up steadily and quietly, and by the time I was 27, I was a senior consultant making $98,000 a year and living in a one-bedroom apartment in Richmond that I had bought with my own money, and nobody in my family asked how I did it because they assumed I was getting by the same way I always had, competently and without fuss. Emma, on the other hand, went to college for 2 years and dropped out because she said it wasn't for her, and my parents said that's okay, not everyone is meant for school, and she moved back home and worked part-time at a boutique and dated a series of men who my mother described as charming and my father described as useless. And when she needed money for rent or a car payment or a girl's trip to Miami, she called me, and I sent it because that's what I had always done. When I was 28, I got a significant promotion, and my salary jumped to $134,000, and I started investing in real estate. I bought a duplex and rented out both units, and I bought a small commercial property that I leased to a coffee shop, and I was building wealth in a way that my family had no idea about, because they never asked what I was doing with my life. They only asked what I could do for theirs. Emma met a man named Carson at a charity gala that my mother had bought her a ticket to, and Carson was 36 and worked in pharmaceutical sales and drove a car that cost more than most people's weddings. And within 3 months, they were engaged, and my mother called me crying happy tears and said, "Emma is going to have the most beautiful wedding," and I said, "That's great, Mom," and she said, "We're going to need your help," and I knew exactly what that meant. The wedding planning started immediately, and Emma sent me a shared spreadsheet with a budget that made my stomach turn. The venue was $18,000, the catering was $22,000, the flowers were $6,500, the photographer was $4,200, and the dress which Emma had already picked out was $12,000, and at the bottom of the spreadsheet there was a line that said Harper's contribution, and next to it was the number $47,000. I stared at that number for a long time, and then I called my mother and I said, "Mom, why is my name on this?" And she said, "Because Emma needs help, and you're her sister, and Carson's family is contributing, and we're contributing, and we just need you to cover the rest." And I said, "The rest is $47,000. And she said, "I know it's a lot, but you make good money. Harper and Emma has dreamed about this her whole life." And I said, "What about what I've dreamed about?" And my mother went quiet, and then she said, "Don't be selfish," and she hung up. I didn't say no. I wish I had, but I didn't. I transferred the money in 3 installments over 2 months. And every time I sent a payment, Emma would text me a heart emoji or a "thank you girl, you're the best." And not once did she call me, not once. Did she ask if I could afford it or if I needed anything in return? She just took the money the way she had always taken everything because in her mind I existed to provide. 2 months before the wedding, I asked Emma when I should expect my invitation, and she said, "Oh, I'll get that to you soon." And I said, "Okay, just let me know if you need a head count for a +1." And she said, "Sure," and she changed the subject, and I felt something small and cold settle in my chest, but I ignored it because I didn't want to believe what I was starting to suspect. 3 weeks before the wedding, I still hadn't received an invitation, and I asked my mother if she knew when they were going out, and my mother said, "Oh, Harper didn't. Emma talked to you," and I said, "Talk to me about what?" And she said the venue has my capacity limit and they had to make some cuts. And I said, "Cuts?" And she said, "You understand, don't you? It's mostly Carson's family and Emma's friends." And I said I paid $47,000 for this wedding, and my mother said, "I know, and we're so grateful. But it's Emma's day, and she needs to be surrounded by people who are really close to her," and I hung up before she could finish the sentence. I sat in my apartment that night, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt finished with being convenient, finished with being the backup plan, finished with paying for a life I wasn't even invited to watch. And I opened my laptop, and I started looking up the venue because Emma had sent me photos, and I knew it was called the Ashford Estate. And when I found the website, I saw that it was owned by a private investment group, and at the bottom of the page, there was a contact for inquiries, and I sent an email asking if the property was for sale. 3 days later, I was on a call with a commercial real estate agent who told me that the Ashford Estate had been on the market quietly. For the past year, the owners wanted $2.1 million, and it came with the main house, the event barn, and 12 acres, and I asked if they would take $2 million cash, and he said he'd ask, and 2 weeks later I was signing closing documents, and I owned the venue where my sister was getting married in 6 weeks, and she had no idea. I didn't tell anyone, I didn't announce it, I just kept my mouth shut, and I waited. And when Emma sent me the text saying the guest list was full, I replied with a thumbs up, and I felt nothing but clarity because I was done being the person they used and forgot in the same breath. The day of the wedding, I drove to the Ashford Estate, and I parked in the back near the owner's entrance, and I walked into the office where the venue coordinator, a woman named Stephanie, who I had met during the purchase process, was waiting. And she said, "The ceremony is starting. Do you want to watch?" And I said yes, and she turned on the security monitor, and I sat in a chair, and I watched my sister marry a man I had never met in a dress I had bought at a venue I owned, surrounded by 200 people who didn't include me. The reception started at 5, and I stayed in the office, and I watched guests eat food I had paid for and dance to music I had funded. And at 7:30, Stephanie knocked on the door and said, "It's time." And I said, "Okay, let's go." And I walked downstairs and into the reception hall. And the room went quiet the way rooms do when someone who isn't supposed to be there suddenly is. Emma saw me first, and her face went white and then red. And she walked toward me fast, and she said, "Harper, what are you doing here? You can't be here." And I said, "Actually, Emma, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And she said, "You need to leave." And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "I'm calling security." And I said, "Go ahead and write." Then Stephanie stepped forward and said, "Excuse me, everyone, can I have your attention?" And the room turned toward her, and she said, "There's been a slight misunderstanding about the final payment for today's event. The remaining balance of $11,000 is due before the evening concludes." And Emma said, "What are you talking about?" "That was paid." And Stephanie said, "No, ma'am, your family covered the deposit. But the balance is still outstanding." And Emma turned to my mother, who had gone pale, and my mother said, "We thought Harper was covering that." And Stephanie said, "Well, the account holder will need to approve that." And Emma said, "Who is the account holder?" And I raised my hand. Emma stared at me and said, "What?" And I said, "I own this venue." "Emma, I bought it 2 months ago, and every dollar you've spent today, every flower, every piece of cake, every minute of music has been on property that I own, and you didn't invite me to be here as your sister, but here I am anyway, as your landlord." And she looked like I had slapped her, and Carson stepped forward and said, "This is insane." And I said, "No, what's insane is paying $47,000 for a wedding I wasn't invited to. What's insane is spending my entire life funding hers and being thanked with a text that said, 'The guest list is full.'" And I looked at my mother and I said, "You told me to be grateful that Emma let me help. And I am grateful. I'm grateful I finally saw exactly how much I was worth to all of you." Emma started crying and said, "You're ruining my wedding." And I said, "No, Emma. I'm just standing in it the way you've been standing in my bank account for a decade." And I turned to Stephanie and I said, "The remaining balance is waived. Consider it my wedding gift." And then I walked out, and I didn't look back because there was nothing left to see. My mother called me 14 times that night. I didn't answer, Emma sent me a long text calling me vindictive and cruel and petty, and I blocked her number. My father sent an email that said, "We need to have a family meeting," and I replied, "We're not. A family, we're a transaction, and I'm closing my account." I kept the venue. I hired Stephanie full-time to manage it, and it's booked solid now, and every time someone asks me why I bought it, I tell them the truth. I bought it because I could, because I spent years being told my worth was in what I gave. And I decided to invest that worth into something I actually owned, and if that makes me petty, then I'll take it, because petty with boundaries is better than generous and forgotten. If you've ever been the person everyone calls when they need something, and no one calls when they don't, if you've spent years paying for people who wouldn't even save you a seat, I need you to hear this. You are not required to fund people who don't value you. You are not selfish for stopping. You are not cruel for expecting reciprocity. And the moment you close the bank and open your life to people who actually see you is the moment you realize how much of yourself you were spending on people who were never going to pay you back, not in money, but in respect. And that currency matters more than anything you'll ever transfer.